The morning Samantha Mills disappeared did not begin with urgency or fear. It began the way so many ordinary mornings did in East Tennessee in the fall of 1995, quiet and cool, with a thin layer of fog still clinging to the low hills outside Knoxville. Samantha was 21 years old, a junior at the University of Tennessee, and by all accounts, deeply predictable in the best possible way. She planned ahead. She showed up on time. She double-checked things most people assumed would be fine. That Saturday, she woke before her alarm. She had classes during the week and a part-time job at the campus library, shelving books and checking IDs. But weekends were hers. Hiking had become a steady ritual over the past 2 years, especially once the pressure of school began to build. The Appalachian Trail, particularly the sections cutting through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, was familiar territory to her. She'd grown up in Knoxville. These mountains were not an abstract wilderness. They were part of the background of her life. Friends later said Samantha didn't hike to prove anything. She wasn't chasing extremes or pushing limits. She liked the quiet. She liked knowing where she was. Her routes were planned, marked, and written down. She owned guidebooks with notes scribbled in the margins and kept her gear clean and organized. Her backpack, even on short hikes, was always packed the same way. That morning, she followed the same routine. Coffee first, poured into a chipped UT Volunteers mug she'd had since freshman year. She flipped through a folded trail map at her kitchen table, even though she'd already chosen the route days earlier. It was a modest stretch of the Appalachian Trail near Newfound Gap, one she had walked portions of before. The plan was simple. Park at the trailhead mid-morning, hike a few hours northbound, turn back before late afternoon. No overnight gear, no off-trail exploring. Her roommate, still half asleep, remembered Samantha mentioning she'd be back by dinner. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional. Just information, offered casually, the way people do when they expect nothing unusual to happen. Samantha didn't tell many people she was hiking alone because it wasn't new. She often preferred solo hikes, especially short ones. She liked setting her own pace. She liked stopping when she wanted, sitting quietly, writing in a small notebook she sometimes carried. She had declined invitations to hike that weekend, not because she wanted isolation, but because no one else was free at the same time. She was on the road, driving southeast toward the Smokies. Her car, a modest sedan with a faded bumper sticker from a local bookstore, blended into weekend traffic heading toward the park. The weather was cooperative, cool but not cold, no storms forecasted. Leaves had just begun to turn at higher elevations, drawing hikers and tourists alike. At the trailhead parking area, nothing stood out. No one remembered a confrontation. No one remembered anything strange. Samantha locked her car, slung her pack over her shoulders, and stepped onto the trail. She signed no official register. In 1995, many trailheads didn't require it. There was no timestamp beyond what could be guessed later. The trail itself was calm that morning. Other hikers passed through sporadically, most of them couples or small groups. Some later reported seeing a young woman matching Samantha's description, walking alone, moving at an unhurried pace. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't lingering. She looked exactly like someone on a short day hike. Samantha's gear was appropriate for the plan. Sturdy boots, a lightweight jacket, water, snacks, a compact first aid kit. She did not carry a tent or sleeping bag. She did not pack for an overnight stay. That detail would matter later. As the morning wore on, the forest shifted the way it always does, light filtering through leaves, sounds muting and returning with the wind. Samantha followed the trail markers. She stayed on the path. There was no evidence she wandered off intentionally, no reason to believe she wanted to disappear. Somewhere around early afternoon, she reached the point where she planned to turn back. Exactly where that point was would become a question later, but at the time, it was unremarkable. She would have rested, eaten something, maybe written a few lines in her notebook. Then she would have headed back toward the trailhead, retracing her steps. Except she didn't. By late afternoon, Samantha hadn't returned. At first, it didn't register as a problem. Hikes run long. People misjudge time. Her roommate assumed she'd grabbed dinner with friends or stopped somewhere on the drive back. There was no immediate panic. As daylight began to thin, though, the silence became noticeable. Samantha hadn't called. She hadn't left a note. By early evening, the casual assumptions started to fall apart. Samantha was reliable. She checked in. She didn't disappear without explanation. Concern hardened into something heavier. The roommate called Samantha's parents. They hadn't heard from her either. The tone of the calls shifted. Questions turned sharper. Where exactly was she hiking? What time did she leave? What route did she say she was taking? When the Park Service was contacted, the response was cautious but attentive. Rangers asked the standard questions. Solo hiker, day trip, familiar trail, weather stable. No medical issues. They noted the time. Nightfall in the mountains complicates everything. By the time rangers reached the trailhead, Samantha's car was still there, parked exactly where it should have been. Locked. Undisturbed. Inside, nothing suggested she'd planned to stay away. No extra clothes missing. No signs of struggle. Just an ordinary vehicle, waiting for someone who hadn't come back. The trail was dark now, quiet in a way that feels different once you're looking for someone. Flashlights cut narrow tunnels through the trees. Rangers called her name. The sound didn't travel far. They searched until protocol and safety forced them to stop. Night searches in mountainous terrain carry their own risks. There would be more people in the morning, more resources, dogs, organized grids. But standing there in the dark, with Samantha's car cooling in the parking lot, one truth had already settled in. A short, familiar hike had crossed an invisible line. Whatever had delayed her return was no longer just a matter of time management or poor planning. Somewhere between morning and nightfall, something had gone wrong. And by the time the sun rose over the Smokies the next day, the question was no longer when Samantha Mills would come back. It was where she had gone, and why the trail she knew so well had not given her back. By the next morning, the concern surrounding Samantha Mills had hardened into procedure. The early light over the Great Smoky Mountains did not bring relief. It brought clarity. Her car was still parked at the trailhead, untouched, exactly where it had been left the night before. No ticket, no broken glass, no sign that anyone else had been inside it. The doors were locked. Inside, everything looked normal. Too normal. Rangers documented the vehicle first. It was standard protocol, even in 1995. They photographed the interior, noted the mileage, confirmed the license plate. There was no purse missing, no extra clothing gone, no indication she had intended to stay overnight. Her backpack was not in the car, which aligned with the assumption that she had taken it with her onto the trail. Nothing about the scene suggested a struggle or a rushed departure. It looked like someone who fully intended to return. Within hours, the search escalated from a welfare check to a formal missing person operation. Park rangers were joined by county deputies and volunteer search and rescue teams from surrounding areas. This was not yet a media event. There were no helicopters circling overhead, no cameras. It was a methodical response built on training and repetition. They began with what they knew. Samantha had planned a short-day hike on a known stretch of the Appalachian Trail. That narrowed the initial search radius. Teams were assigned grid sections based on distance she could have reasonably covered on foot within the time frame. Maps were spread across the hoods of vehicles. Routes were marked in pencil. Each team was given specific instructions. Stay within your grid. Mark what you cover. Report everything. Scent dogs arrived mid-morning. Handlers were given items that carried Samantha's scent. A borrowed pillowcase from her dorm room. A jacket. The dogs picked up the trail quickly, noses low, moving with purpose along the path Samantha was believed to have taken. For the first stretch, everything aligned with expectations. The dogs followed the Appalachian Trail northbound, just as Samantha had said she planned to do. Searchers moved carefully. The terrain in that area is deceptive. The trail itself is well maintained, but just beyond it, the land drops sharply in places, thick with brush, loose rock, and uneven footing. Rangers scanned for disturbed leaves, broken branches, anything that suggested someone had left the path. By early afternoon, the dogs slowed near a section where the trail curved along a steep ravine. The drop-off there was significant, but not immediately visible from the main path. The ground fell away at an angle that could easily be missed by someone not looking directly at it. This was not an unusual place for hikers to stop and rest. It was quiet, sheltered, slightly off the wind. Then, the dogs stopped. Handlers described it later in careful language. The scent did not fade gradually. It did not scatter the way it often does when someone wanders or backtracks. It ended, abruptly, as if Samantha Mills had stepped off the trail and vanished. That moment changed the tone of the search. Teams were redirected toward the ravine. Searchers moved down slope in controlled lines, checking under logs, scanning rock faces, listening for anything out of place. If Samantha had slipped and fallen, there should have been evidence. A broken branch, displaced stones, a piece of clothing. Something. They found nothing. The ravine was searched repeatedly over the next 2 days. Different teams, different angles. No body, no backpack, no trace. The dogs were brought back again and again, each time leading to the same point, then stopping, confused. Investigators began to debate possibilities. The first was the simplest. A fall. People fall off trails in the Smokies every year, but falls usually leave signs, and bodies are usually found, especially with this many people searching this quickly. The terrain was difficult, but not impossible. And yet, there was no evidence she had gone over the edge. The second theory was disorientation, that Samantha had wandered off the trail, become lost, and succumbed to exposure. But this had also raised problems. Samantha was experienced. She knew this trail. The weather had been stable. Temperatures overnight were cool, but not lethal. And again, search teams found no indication she had traveled far beyond the trail corridor. The third theory was uncomfortable, and at first, quietly resisted. That she had encountered someone else. In 1995, the Appalachian Trail was not isolated. It was busy in sections, especially during fair weather. Most hikers were harmless, but not all. Rangers reviewed reports from that day. A few hikers remembered seeing a young woman alone. None remembered seeing her with anyone else. No one reported an argument. No one heard a scream. Still, the abrupt end of the scent did not sit well with experienced handlers. People don't simply evaporate on a forest trail. Even if someone is carried, dragged, or assisted off the path, there are usually traces. Footprints. Broken vegetation. The absence of evidence began to feel like evidence itself. Weather complicated everything. A light rain moved through the area on the second night of searching. Not enough to cause flooding, but enough to disturb scents and soften ground. Rangers knew that with each passing hour, the odds shifted. Scent degrades. Tracks disappear. The trail resets itself. By the third day, helicopters were authorized. They flew low passes over the ravine and surrounding forest, scanning for color contrasts, unnatural shapes, anything that didn't belong. From the air, the forest looked endless, dense, indifferent. Samantha's family arrived during this phase of the search. They stood near the command post, watching teams come and go, clinging to routine updates. Her parents asked the same questions again and again. Where have you searched? Are you sure you didn't miss something? When will the dogs go out again? Investigators answered honestly. They had no reason to believe she was alive, and no reason to believe she was dead. That limbo is its own kind of cruelty. As days turned into a week, the search footprint expanded. Teams moved farther out, beyond what Samantha could have reasonably reached on foot. The logic shifted from probability to possibility. Maybe she was injured and crawling. Maybe she had followed a sound. Maybe she had panicked. Nothing held up. By the end of the second week, the operation was scaled back. Not because they wanted to stop, but because they had to. Resources were finite. There were other calls, other missing people. Rangers documented that every step, every grid searched, every theory considered. The official record showed a clean timeline that led nowhere. A car at a trailhead, a scent that ended at a ravine. No body, no belongings, no explanation. You standing at the edge of that trail, looking down into the ravine where the dogs had stopped. One ranger said later that it felt like the trail itself had made a decision. It had given them just enough to follow, and then it had shut the door. And as the search formally transitioned from rescue to recovery, one quiet question settled over everyone involved, unanswered and heavy. If Samantha Mills didn't fall, and she didn't wander off, then something else happened out there. Something no one had seen. When the active search ended, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a withdrawal. The people left behind did not go home with answers, only with the slow, uncomfortable realization that the mountains had not given Samantha Mills back. The official language shifted first. Then even that word was used less often. Weeks passed. Search crews were reduced. Volunteers returned to their lives. Rangers stopped meeting daily and began filing reports instead. The trail reopened fully to hikers who had no reason to think about the young woman who had vanished there. Leaves fell. Weather changed. Life moved forward everywhere except the places Samantha had occupied. Her parents refused to let the case settle into silence. They returned to Knoxville with nothing tangible to hold on to. Samantha's dorm room remained untouched for months. Her clothes stayed folded the way she left them. Her notebooks were stacked neatly on her desk. Her voicemail message stayed active, her voice preserved in a few seconds of casual greeting. Her mother called it sometimes, just to hear it ring. Professors removed her name from rosters. Her student ID expired. The systems that tracked her existence adjusted without emotion. But at home, nothing adjusted at all. Her parents kept expecting the phone to ring with an explanation that made sense. A head injury, amnesia, a wrong turn that led her somewhere unexpected. Anything that allowed for a return. Investigators continued working the case, but now it was done quietly, away from command posts and search grids. Detectives reread witness statements. They replayed timelines. They looked for human error. Something missed. Something misunderstood. One statement stood out. A hiker who had come forward early on said he remembered seeing Samantha late in the afternoon, closer to dusk than earlier estimates suggested. That detail had initially been dismissed as faulty memory. People misjudge time in the woods, but when detectives laid his account next to other verified sightings, it didn't fit. If his memory was accurate, Samantha would have been behind schedule, lingering far longer than her plan suggested. That raised a question no one liked asking. Why would someone as careful as Samantha still be on the trail that late? Another detail resurfaced months later. A park maintenance worker reported an unfamiliar vehicle parked near a restricted service road, not far from the section of trail where Samantha's scent had ended. At the time, it hadn't seemed urgent. The park saw unusual vehicles all the time: contractors, visitors who ignored signs. The description was vague, dark-colored, older model, no plate recorded. By the time detectives revisited that lead, it was too late. There was no camera footage, no log, no way to trace it back. The lead was filed, circled in red pen, and left unresolved. The most troubling fact remained unchanged. Despite the speed and scale of the initial search, despite the dogs, the helicopters, the repeated sweeps, Samantha's body had never been found. Not a bone, not a scrap of clothing, not even the backpack she carried. In wilderness cases, bodies are often discovered years later by hikers or hunters. The Smokies are vast, but not unknowable. People eventually surface. Samantha hadn't. That absence became the center of the investigation. Detectives debated it privately. If she had fallen into the ravine, her remains should have been visible within weeks. If she had wandered off and succumbed to exposure, animals might scatter remains, but something would surface. The complete lack of physical evidence was inconsistent with every standard outcome they knew. By the late 1990s, the case was officially classified as cold, not closed. Cold. The distinction mattered to the family, even if it changed nothing in practice. Cold meant the file stayed open. It meant someone could look at it again. But cold also meant time. Time erodes details. Witnesses forget. Landscapes change. Trees grow. Trails are rerouted. The park evolved, indifferent to unresolved questions. New rangers arrived who had never heard Samantha's name unless someone told them. Her parents marked anniversaries alone. Birthdays. Holidays. The day she disappeared. Each year, the gap between who Samantha was and who she might have become grew wider. Friends graduated, moved away, started families. Samantha stayed 21. Occasionally, tips came in. Sightings in other states. A woman who looked like her at a bus station. A call from someone convinced they had met her. Each lead was followed. Each one ended the same way. Hope, then collapse. Detectives kept the file alive out of habit as much as duty. Every few years, someone would pull it from storage, flip through the photographs, reread the reports. The ending never changed. Car at trailhead. Scent lost at ravine. No recovery. The case survived mostly in memory, in the minds of her parents, in the quiet recollections of a few rangers who had been there in 1995 and never quite shook the feeling that something had gone wrong in a way they couldn't define. As the years stretched on, the Appalachian Trail absorbed Samantha's disappearance into its long history. One more story hikers whispered about, one more name attached to a place. But for those who had known her, the mystery did not fade. It hardened. Because the mountains do not keep secrets forever. They keep them until someone steps in exactly the wrong place, and 26 years later, someone would. Time did not solve the disappearance of Samantha Mills. It thinned it out. Years passed in a way that felt uneven, quiet stretches broken by moments that stirred old questions, and then settled back into silence. The Appalachian Trail continued to receive millions of footsteps, and most of them moved over the same ground Samantha had walked without ever knowing her name. But the land around that section of trail did not stay static. It aged. It shifted. It kept things, but never all at once. In the early 2000s, a backcountry ranger documented an unusual boot print found several hundred yards off the main trail, deeper than most casual hikers ventured. The tread pattern didn't match common brands sold in the region at the time. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't ancient either. It was photographed, logged, and compared against park records. Nothing matched. No other prints were found nearby. On its own, it meant nothing. It was filed and forgotten. A few years later, a volunteer clearing brush near an unofficial campsite found a strip of fabric tangled in low branches, sun-bleached, torn. The material was synthetic, common in outdoor clothing. There were no identifying marks, no color that stood out. Rangers collected it, bagged it, and sent it for basic analysis. The result was inconclusive. It could have come from any number of hikers over decades. It was dismissed as unrelated. Then there was the fire ring. It sat far from established campsites, tucked into a shallow depression beyond a network of game trails. Rangers stumbled upon it during routine maintenance. The stones were blackened, old. This wasn't a recent illegal camp. It had been there for years. No trash, no gear. Just the remains of repeated fires in a place no one was supposed to be. The area was documented, but again, nothing tied it directly to Samantha. The park was full of forgotten human traces. That was the reality of a place this old and this large. None of these discoveries were enough to reopen the case. Cold cases require something solid. DNA, a confession. Remains. Fragments without context only deepen uncertainty. And yet, for the few people who still carried Samantha's file in their minds, these small, unsettling finds reinforced a quiet belief. The trail hadn't erased what happened. It had scattered it. Former rangers who had worked the original search began to talk more openly as the years went on. Not publicly, not to the press, but to each other. They compared memories. They admitted doubts they hadn't voiced at the time. Several agreed on one thing. Samantha's disappearance never fit the pattern of a lost hiker. People who get lost tend to behave predictably. Panic drives them downhill. They follow water. They leave trails of movement, even if they don't mean to. They shed items. They make noise. They attempt shelter. Samantha had done none of those things, at least not in any way that left evidence behind. The scent dogs had troubled them the most. An abrupt end without scatter was rare. It suggested interruption, not confusion. But without physical proof, that thought stayed hypothetical, locked behind professional restraint. Psychologists who later reviewed the case echoed those concerns. Samantha's background mattered. She was experienced. She was methodical. She had planned a short hike. She was not facing extreme weather or injury conditions that would have pushed her into irrational behavior. The idea that she wandered aimlessly until she vanished contradicted what was known about her. Her parents aged alongside the case. They moved houses, downsized, but never let go. Boxes of documents followed them. Newspaper clippings, copies of reports, maps marked with faded ink. They learned the language of missing persons, learned what to ask, what not to expect. They stopped waiting for good news and started hoping for clarity. Occasionally, someone would reach out, a retired ranger admitting he still thought about her. A hiker convinced a find meant something more. Each contact reopened the wound briefly, then closed it again. There was no progression, just repetition. The Appalachian Trail itself changed. Sections were rerouted for safety or erosion. Vegetation thickened in some areas and thinned in others. Storms reshaped slopes. What had once been visible became buried. What had been buried surfaced unexpectedly. By the late 2010s, Samantha's case existed mostly in files and memory. New investigators inherited it without emotional attachment. To them, it was an old disappearance with no remains and no suspects, statistically unlikely to resolve, practically dormant. But the trail doesn't operate on statistics. It operates on chance, on foot placement, on weather, on someone choosing curiosity over caution, stepping away from the main path because something doesn't look right. The idea that evidence had been missed didn't bother the original searchers as much as the idea that it hadn't been missed at all, that it simply hadn't been accessible yet. That terrain had hidden it, protected it, and waited. Former rangers spoke about the way the forest absorbs disturbances slowly, not like a crime scene in a city, where activity erases traces quickly. Out here, time layers things instead of removing them. Leaves fall, soil shifts, roots grow around objects. What disappears doesn't vanish. It gets held. By 2021, nearly 26 years had passed since Samantha Mills walked onto the Appalachian Trail and didn't come back. Her parents were older, their expectations narrower. They no longer asked when the truth would come out, only if it ever would. That same year, a seasoned hiker set out on a familiar route after a heavy storm altered sections of the trail. Detours were common after weather like that. Trees fell, paths washed out. The trail demanded improvisation. He stepped off the marked route, just briefly, following a narrow cut in the brush that looked like it led somewhere solid. It led somewhere no one had stood in decades, and the trail, finally disturbed in the right place, began to give back what it had been holding. The storm had moved through the mountains fast and without ceremony, the way late-season weather often does at higher elevation. Trees came down. Sections of the Appalachian Trail washed out or narrowed into unstable edges. By the time the sky cleared, park officials posted temporary advisories, warning hikers to expect detours and rough footing. For most people, that meant turning back. For some, it meant improvising. The hiker who made the discovery in the fall of 2021 was not reckless. He was experienced, methodical, and familiar with this section of the trail. He had logged thousands of miles over the years and understood the difference between curiosity and danger. When he encountered a washed-out segment where the trail skirted a steep drop, he chose the safer option. He stepped off the marked path, following what looked like a narrow, stable line through the brush. At first, there was nothing remarkable about it. Fallen leaves, wet soil, exposed roots gripping the slope like knuckles. He moved slowly, watching his footing, focused on rejoining the trail a few yards ahead. Then, he noticed something that did not belong. It wasn't immediately obvious, just a strip of faded fabric, partially buried, caught beneath a tangle of roots near a rock outcrop. At a glance, it looked like debris carried down by runoff. But the material wasn't natural. It was woven, synthetic, purpose-made. When he brushed away a layer of leaves, the shape became clearer. A backpack strap. It was still attached to something. The hiker stopped moving. Years of experience told him not to touch anything further. He marked the location, stepped back, and began the careful process of retracing his route, heart pounding in a way it hadn't from the storm or the terrain. He contacted park authorities as soon as he regained signal. Rangers reached the site later that day. Access was difficult. The ravine was steep, unstable, and had been considered too dangerous for thorough searches in the past. It was one of the reasons earlier efforts had focused elsewhere. But now, with a confirmed find, risk calculations changed. They moved cautiously, documenting everything. As more leaves and soil were cleared, the outline of a backpack emerged, collapsed inward, its frame warped by time. Nearby, partially concealed by rock and root, were bones, not scattered widely, not disturbed in the way animal activity often leaves remains. They lay where a body had come to rest and stayed. Recovery took days. Each step was deliberate. Each item was photographed, logged, and removed in sequence. The remains were fragile, but remarkably intact, preserved by elevation, shade, and long winters. Clothing fibers clung to bone. Boot fragments lay close by. There was no doubt this was a human recovery. Identification took longer, but not as long as anyone feared. Dental records confirmed what some of the older rangers already suspected the moment the location was reported. The remains belonged to Samantha Mills. After 26 years, she had been found less than a mile from where the dogs had lost her scent. The news reached her parents quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, just a call, measured and careful, offering confirmation they had lived without for more than 2 decades. Grief returned, sharp and immediate, but it was joined by something unfamiliar. Certainty. The waiting was over. For investigators, the recovery did not close the case. It reopened it. The location alone challenged every major theory from 1995. Samantha had not fallen from the trail into the ravine accidentally. The slope leading to where she was found required deliberate descent. There was no evidence of a slip or uncontrolled fall. No broken branches or impact points consistent with a sudden drop. Then, there were the remains themselves. Forensic analysis revealed trauma inconsistent with exposure or a long, slow decline. Bone damage suggested a force applied during life, not post-mortem. Subtle, but unmistakable to trained eyes. This was not someone who lay down and succumbed to the elements. The backpack raised more questions. It was intact, but its contents told a story that didn't align with earlier assumptions. Items were present that should have been used if Samantha had been lost for an extended period. Emergency supplies untouched, food still sealed. A whistle never blown. Most unsettling of all was an object found several feet away from the body, partially embedded in soil. It did not belong to Samantha. It was not standard hiking equipment. It showed signs of age and handling, but no obvious origin. Investigators cataloged it carefully, understanding immediately that this single item could reshape the entire narrative. The recovery site suggested containment, not chaos. Samantha had not wandered until she collapsed. She had been brought here, or led here, and left. Investigators revisited old statements with new eyes. The unidentified vehicle near the service road. The witness who saw her later than expected. The abrupt end of the scent trail. Pieces that had never fit now formed a shape that was impossible to ignore. This was no longer a disappearance without explanation. It was a crime hidden by terrain and time. For the rangers who had searched in 1995, the discovery was both relief and regret. Relief that Samantha had been found. Regret that the ravine had remained unchecked for so long. But the truth was harsher and simpler. The land had protected the scene, not out of intent, but by design. As forensic reports continued to come in, one conclusion solidified. Samantha Mills had not died alone, and the evidence recovered with her, silent for 26 years, was finally ready to speak. The evidence did not arrive all at once. It came in measured pieces, each one narrowing the space where uncertainty had lived for 26 years. For investigators, this was no longer a matter of asking what might have happened. It was about reconstructing what did. The clothing told the first part of the story. Fabric damage on Samantha Mills' jacket and shirt was inconsistent with long-term exposure or animal activity. The tears were directional, concentrated, and matched patterns typically seen during a physical struggle. Not a prolonged fight. Something brief. Sudden. Enough force to leave marks, but not enough time for chaos. Bone trauma confirmed what the clothing suggested. The fractures were not the result of a fall down the ravine. They occurred before death, applied while Samantha was still alive. The force was localized, controlled, not random. Forensic pathologists were careful with their language, but the conclusion was clear. This was not an accident. Investigators focused next on the object found near her remains. It had been cataloged early, but now it took on a heavier weight. The item was utilitarian, worn, and did not belong to Samantha. More importantly, it was not something she could have reasonably acquired or carried on her planned hike. Its placement suggested it had been dropped, not placed. Lost during movement, not left intentionally. That detail mattered. When detectives overlaid the recovery site with older maps, a timeline began to emerge. Samantha's scent ending near the ravine now made sense. She had not wandered there on her own. She had been redirected. The descent into the restricted area was deliberate, but not by her choice alone. Investigators believe the encounter occurred near the trail, close to where other hikers might have been earlier in the day. It would have been quick. A conversation. A moment of trust or hesitation. Enough time for someone to gain control without drawing attention. The trail, busy hours earlier, had begun to thin by late afternoon. Timing mattered. Samantha was led or forced off the trail, down a route few would willingly take. The terrain itself acted as concealment. Once below the main path, visibility dropped, sound carried poorly, and the chances of being seen disappeared. The confrontation ended where she was found. There was no evidence of prolonged captivity, no signs she had lived there for days, no attempt to survive. Her supplies remained unused because she was never lost in the way people had imagined. She was intercepted. As the reconstruction solidified, the case was officially reclassified. The manner of death was no longer undetermined. It was homicide. The person responsible was never charged. Investigators traced the object found at the scene to a man who had been known to frequent that section of the park in the mid-1990s. He had since died, years earlier, from natural causes. His history included violent behavior that had never resulted in conviction. There was no direct witness, no confession. The evidence was circumstantial, but strong enough to bring internal consensus. For the law, it was not enough to prosecute. For the truth, it was enough to name. When Samantha's parents were informed of the findings, the meeting was private. There were no microphones, No public statements prepared in advance. Just a quiet room, documents spread across a table, and the slow delivery of facts that could never be taken back. They listened. They asked questions. They stopped asking questions. What they received was not justice. There would be no trial, no sentence, no public reckoning. What they received was certainty, the end of speculation, the end of imagining worse and worse outcomes in the absence of facts. They learned that Samantha had not been afraid for long, that the encounter was brief, that she did not suffer alone in the wilderness, slowly realizing she would not be found. That mattered to them more than anyone expected. Her remains were returned home. The Appalachian Trail continued on, unchanged to the casual observer. Hikers passed within yards of the ravine without knowing what had been there, what had waited. But for those who knew the case, the trail was no longer just a place of disappearance. It was a place of recovery. Former rangers visited the site one last time, not officially, not on record. They stood quietly, acknowledging a search that had never truly ended until now. The feeling was not relief. It was resolution. Samantha Mills' name moved from a list of missing persons to a closed case file. The words "presumed deceased" were replaced with something heavier. But honest, her life was no longer frozen in uncertainty. It had an ending. The woods had kept her story for 26 years, not out of cruelty, but because no one had stepped into the right place until the right moment. When that finally happened, the truth surfaced intact enough to be recognized. Some mysteries end with answers. Others end with understanding. For Samantha's family, and for those who never stopped wondering, the trail finally gave back what it had taken. Not justice, but the truth.